What if it's a trap?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head,
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is the final deep dive in the series of 10, and in this analysis, I want to test how well you've organized and arranged your thinking in this case. It's no good to wade through the criminal psychology, get a handle on it, grasp some of the finer subtleties and details about symbolic thinking and identity and what type of aggression is at work, but then lose sight of the woods. Have you? Have you gotten lost in all those trees? Well, it's easy enough to do. We'll find out just how clear and firm our thought process is by asking a seemingly simple question. You might want to write this down and look at it and study it and think about it for a couple of minutes on your own time. Here it is. How did Rex Heuermann rehabilitate himself? Now, I recommend you take a little time to think about it. This is your chance to do some kind of original thinking, to put in a little bit of mental effort. So I do recommend that you take it. Once we've completed this analysis, you're not going to be able to come back because the process will have been addressed. Take my advice, take a little or a lot of time, maybe a couple of hours even, to work your way through this question. And here's a tip for how to deal with the question. The question itself.
It's undoubtedly a trap.
Or put another way, it's a trick question. With that in mind, let's begin, shall we? We're going to deal with the long way around, but before we get to that, if you haven't already subscribed, please do. If you've been enjoying this series, particularly enjoying this series, I'm going to ask you in the comments to let me know if you'd like a follow-up series, basically a sequel to this series, maybe 5 or 10 episodes where we'll go even deeper. You probably have realized that this channel goes way, way, way beyond the sort of level that many other channels do, and without any reward. I mean, when we do it, or when I do it, I kind of get punished. People ridicule me. They don't understand what it's about, and very few people, it's just not very popular. So there's not much of an incentive in doing it. Obviously, if I'm going to continue with the sequel, you're going to need to show your interest, show your commitment in super thanks or in the thanks button. So let me know. I can also do recorded clips, which I can then play live and interact live with you guys. So we can maybe do that in the second series. But let's first get an indication of how interested you guys are in that. Okay, and so without further ado, let's deal with episode 10, the finale in this series dealing with Rex Heuermann, more specifically his psychology. So, are you ready? If you spend time addressing the question, the question about how did he rehabilitate himself, right? Then and hopefully you've wrote down a few notes, then here's where you can measure the efficacy of your reasoning. This is quite a good experiment, a good opportunity to challenge yourself in terms of the quality and clarity of your reasoning. And so one more chance to do that if you haven't done it already. Before we jump in, write down the question, how did he rehabilitate himself, Rex Heuermann? And remember,
your question depends on me understanding what you hope to achieve by coming here.
So we begin the long way around to answering this question on rehabilitation by asking another question. Did the killing stop? I mean, in order for there to be a rehabilitation, there's got to be a period where certain activities, certain actions stop and stop for an extended period. So did that happen? And so if the answer is yes, if the killings did stop, when did they stop? And now we can begin to think in a layered, systematic way. We can work our way through this riddle. And we're gonna do it by taking the position of working within what we know. Not what we think we know, not what we believe we know, but what law enforcement have basically put as legally actionable fact. Obviously, it's not officially fact, but it's certainly evidence that they believe is strong. Hasn't quite been proved yet in a court of law. So in other words, what we're doing is we're taking facts that are not in dispute and try to develop and organize our ideas around these facts. And so we're not going to make vague statements like his victims are the tip of the iceberg, or there are many, many victims still out there. We won't basically dilute our reasoning by spreading our butter over too much bread, right? If this feels limiting and irks you, you're going to see why in a moment, why imagining some amorphous pile of human bodies with no names, no dates, no science behind them, no connections, that is a trap of another order, or perhaps more accurately, a dead end. You're welcome to go down that road and you're going to end up absolutely nowhere. Because it simply takes you not only into the unknown, but the unknowable, certainly at this point. So what do we know for sure? Again, what do we know for sure? Well, from what we know, the serial killer's clock starts on, you might want to write this down, November 19th or 20th, 1993. That's from what we know. And it starts November 19th or 20th, 1993 with Sandra Constilla, originally from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm not going to explain why just yet, but it's less important to get when the clock starts right in terms of this particular assessment than when it stops, right? Remember, the ambit of our question is how did he rehabilitate himself? This is indirectly a question of when. Obviously, as I say, he can't rehabilitate himself before he has committed any of the crimes, nor can he begin that process somewhere in the middle. Do you agree? It can only happen at the end when all the murders stop. And so when it starts is really less important. Not unimportant, just less important in terms of what we're asking here. Makes sense, right? But can we answer that? When does this bloodbath in Long Island, especially along Gilgo Beach, when does it finally stop? And, I've driven down there, I've walked on the beach, I've gone to Ewerman's house, I've gone to his office, and you are seeing these landscapes, urban and somewhat rural and kind of seascapes. You sort of feel like you don't know something. There's something that you don't know. Something is eluding you. And so this is really central to that. When did the bloodbath stop? Why did it stop? And this is a far more onerous question, and thus it's vital we get it right, when it stops than when it starts. And so how do we answer it? Well, we look at what we agreed to do a moment ago. We take the position of working within what we know. Imagine that. And where's that going to take us, do you think? So let's have a look. Based on the victims that have been already definitively linked to Ewerman, in terms of the prosecution's case, in terms of the case from law enforcement side, who has he been charged with killing? And more pertinently, more specifically, who is the last on that timeline? Do you know? Well, it's this woman, Amber Lynn Costello. It's quite ironic that it seems to begin, based on what we know, with someone called Costilla, and it seems to end, again, based on what we know, with someone called Costello. According to Wikipedia, Costello 27 of West Babylon, New York, a small town 10 miles north of Gilgo Beach, was a sex worker and heroin user who went missing on September 2nd, 2010. There's your date. Based on what we know, there's your date, write it down. And so our hypothetical timeline, yes, it might change. But for right now, we've got to start somewhere. Our hypothetical timeline is November 1993 to September 2010. When you look at the timeline, you also kind of get a sense that these crimes mostly seem to happen in summer. No crimes in December, January, February. I'm wondering if there's one in March. There might be one in March, but certainly not in that midwinter period. And so between November 1993 and September 2010, it's about 17 years, right? 1993 to 2010, 17 years. It's a long time to be committing murders and getting away with them. 17 years. We also see that there's a kind of traffic jam of crimes, guess when? In 2010, where victims are killed almost back to back on June 6, 2010, and again on September 2nd, 2010. That's barely 3 months between two murders. Now, if we take all 6 victims we know about, the pace of killing seems to pick up, even if we just look at the years in which they allegedly took place. 1993, 2003, 2007, 2009, 2010, and again in 2010. Now, even if this is incomplete, it's still telling us what we would have predicted anyway. That is, growing more confident, that the crimes are gathering in momentum and speed and pace, that one has a sense that he's getting better at his craft, but perhaps worse at resisting a particular impulse. His hunger to hunt is getting harder to resist. Just in the period 2009 to 2010, there are 3 victims. That's half the total that can be definitively linked to the suspect. And then, after 3 victims in 2009 to 2010, what happens? Nothing. He seems to stop. Nothing happens, as far as we know, in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, all the way up to today. He seems to stop. Let's, for the sake of argument, accept and agree that he does stop. And let's speculate now, based on what we've anchored so far in what appears to be factual. And let's speculate that also, let's theorize that he stops in September 2010. There are no crimes apparently after that. And so if we do accept that, the question arises, why does he stop in 2010? Why do these serial killings stop in 2010? So we've gone from the first question, which is, how did Rex Heuermann rehabilitate himself, to kind of a more accurate question, did the killing stop? Then when did they stop? And now we sort of take it slightly further and we say, okay, if they did stop in September 2010, why then? Why? And why did, if that's true, why did they remain, why did it remain, that status quo remain like that for another decade? Why? Any ideas? Now, I've seen some speculating in the comments as we went through the series that there was no rehabilitation, just a hiatus, a temporary stay of hostilities. Now, although the thinking on this is heading in the right direction, and there definitely is some truth in it, it's still off. It's still kind of a vague way of saying, I think this happened. So let's speculate in terms of the question itself. Let's say, without doing any research on what has been achieved with other serial killers, and that's really how you need to start this whole process. Do some research, gather information, educate yourself. But without doing that, we can assume for the sake of argument that our serial killer, for reasons unknown, commits his final serial kill in September 2010, and then he throws away Mindhunter and never looks back. Why? Now, again, you might be sitting there saying, well, I'm really getting angry with this. That is not what happened. I'm sure this. But what happens when you actually do go down that road? What happens when you do accept a hypothesis and then just take it further, take the reasoning a bit further? Well, you might be surprised when you allow yourself to actually think about certain things, you actually make some discoveries. You stumble upon some insights that you didn't give yourself permission previously to think about. And so that's what we're going to do now. Why does he stop in September 2010, and why is he able to, in a way, move on with his life? Why? Well, here's one possibility. Victoria. Now, again, whether our theory is sensible or not, it's hard to imagine Human's biological daughter didn't have a profound influence on him, not only as a person, but also more importantly as a man, as how a man related to a woman, how a man related to the opposite sex, how a man related to females, right? And again, you can more generally synthesize the question to simply ask, do you think Victoria had any kind of effect on Rex Human? Do you think Victoria had any kind of effect? And if you say yes, do you think it was a significant effect or insignificant? I think many of us would agree it was probably a significant effect. Victoria was born in 1997, 4 years after the first murder that we know of. And the greatest span of time that separates any two murders occurs right here, in the period interrupted, so to speak, by the arrival of Victoria. 10 years after the first murder, the second murder that we know of happens in 2003. What's significant about that date, that year? Well, in 2003, Victoria is 6 years old. That's typically the age when young parents get something of a breather from that sort of constantly on, 24/7 period that one's got to deal with during the terrible 2s and 3s, and that finally, that sort of holocaust of chores and taking care of someone eventually gives way to where the little one heads to the custody of big school, and so one's time is freed up to some extent. And so that's in the very same year that Victoria leaves home to start her school career. That's when murder number 2, as far as we know, happens. And it's this woman, Jessica Taylor. The distance, and here's a clue, the distance in time from the second victim to the third is half now what the distance was between the first and the second. It's gone from a 10-year intermission to just 4. What does this murder have to do with Victoria, if anything? The second murder. Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with it. It's unclear, but we do know at this stage Victoria is 10 years old, which, if anything, it's slap bang in the middle of puberty. And then the next murder halves the intermission time of the previous period from 4 years to 2. And the next murder halves the time again from 2 years to 1. And the final murders occur within about 3 months of each other. It's accelerating. In 2010, Victoria would have been 17 years old, about to embark on the next phase of her life, adulthood, college, right? The end of high school. But certainly also, just before that, going to the prom, having boyfriends, and all that activity in preparing oneself to some extent in terms of the opposite sex and in terms of one's peers and sort of finding one's place in society. How did that process affect her father, who's looking on, who's there? who sees how his daughter develops, who sees how she's treated by her peers. And so it's during this time that the Long Island serial killer hits his stride, killing more women at a faster pace than ever before. And then, boom, it stops. Why? It's been accelerating and then it stops. Why? Now, it could be that Victoria humanizes him, but you would imagine if that was the case, it would be going in the opposite direction. Lots of crimes in the beginning happening quickly after one another, and then slowing down, and then eventually stopping. But that's not what's happening. The crimes are gathering in pace. They're not diminishing. So good luck with that idea. Victoria may instead be triggering his memories of high school through her own high school journey. And to be clear, he's not being triggered, we're assuming, in a good, positive, or constructive way. He's being reminded of a really traumatic period, and there's not a silver lining to that. So if we decide to go down the yellow brick road of rehabilitation, Victoria doesn't seem to be the answer anymore, does she? If you don't really think about it, she seems to be the answer. But if you do, she doesn't. Okay, so if we rule that out, what else could have a rehabilitating effect? Well, how about work? So let's think about the architect. What if the architect, through his job, is starting to develop a sense of agency, and thus starts to ameliorate that, at last, those feelings of impotency? He's starting to feel like one of the champions, one of the sort of heroic figures, the towering figures stomping the streets of Manhattan. And what if he even becomes a little socialized? He meets clients, he heads out to watering holes with his employees, he strikes deals. Well, I'm going to say no. In the same way that Victoria isn't soothing him in a global way, but triggering dormant and non-dormant aspects of him, I'm pretty sure the fabric of Manhattan is doing the same. See, he has a severe psychological wound inflicted as a child and a young man, and that's just not going to change. It can't be rehabilitated. And that then brings us to the difference between criminal psychology and psychology. Now, it would be unreasonable to expect you to know this, but although criminal psychology derives itself from ordinary psychology, it's not a feedback mechanism. It doesn't go back in that same direction. It's not interchangeable. Once you step over that line, it's done. And you don't just revert back to ordinary psychology just because you feel like it, especially when we're dealing with serial killers. Now, that's not to say if a hypothetical person A or hypothetical person B had an almost carbon copy upbringing to our serial killer suspect, that they'd become serial killers too. They might start heading along that path, but then they might, for certain reasons of resilience and a stronger sense of identity and perhaps a few other things, bring themselves back from the brink. And so that is also a really interesting question. What rehabilitates people who are going on a destructive path, and then they don't actually take the step into criminality? And in that sense, they rehabilitate themselves. What is that process? What's happening there? The answer is any manner of things, but clearly one of them is our own choices. Making good decisions, making the right decision. And whatever those choices are, it's also how much we feed those choices. If you make a wrong decision, how much do you continue persisting down that road and feeding those choices? They say the battle inside of us is between two wolves. The one who lives is the one you feed the most. Make bad choices, go down the road to pleasure land and allow your psychology to stew there for long enough, and like it's so brilliantly portrayed in Pinocchio, you become someone else. That's where paths of least resistance take you. By the way, the whole true crime thing on YouTube, where you click on whatever is resonating with you. You click on whatever you believe agrees with what you think. Those are, in a way, paths of least resistance. And it's kind of a contract between the creator and their audience. The audience want to hear certain things and want to believe certain things, and the creator indulges them. The creator gets rich, and the audience kind of gets to feel the way they want to feel about the world. It's also going down a path of least resistance. It's not very good for you. It's not very good for the world. So any number of things could have rehabilitated the serial killer in the making, but the key thing here would have been self-awareness and awareness of the process as it's actually unfolding. Can I see what I'm becoming? Do I see the pattern? Can I see that I'm starting to grow donkey's ears and a tail? Do I have the wherewithal to change course? Do I have self-discipline? Am I going to do the thing that's harder or the thing that's easier? Am I going to think critically and sort of interrupt my own daydreams and fairy tales, my own pleasant sort of delusions, or not? Because make no mistake, a failure here compounds and compounds and compounds, just like the first suck of a cigarette or the first swig or snort from a gateway drug, how that potentially paves your road to ruin. It starts, big things have a small beginning. But that's the long answer in terms of the question regarding humiliation. Sorry, that was a slip. I mean rehabilitation. How did Rex Heuermann rehabilitate himself? More appropriately then, why did the killing stop? Now, if you've been cynical all along about the thought process, you're listening to this like, well, he's so arrogant, he thinks he knows so much, he doesn't really know anything, and he's wrong about all of this, right? If you've been cynical all along, this is where I believe I make my case, even with incomplete evidence and information. So even if I am wrong in terms of these dates, this is where I think I prove my case, or certainly make a very valid point. The quick answer to that question, why did the killing stop, I believe is not by choice. He didn't just decide, you know what, that's enough. So if he didn't choose to stop, what then? And if it wasn't Victoria, and it wasn't work, and it wasn't a change of heart, if it wasn't by choice, what then? What changed? Well, this. And that brings us to the short answer.
Time. The answer is time.
Yes, it is. The answer is time. About 4 months after the Long Island serial killer dispatched his last victim, do you remember when that was? It was early September 2010. Human remains were found by a cadaver dog called Blue, belonging to Suffolk County Officer John Marlier. Now, 1 month after Shannon Gilbert vanished, that was in May 2010. So in June 2010, Marlier had come up with nothing, searching for Gilbert in that gated community area where she was last seen. And I've actually been there myself. I've also kind of walked in the brush and that sort of swampy area and kind of snagged my clothes on the brush and thorns and things. I've been there myself. And it's difficult. And it's dense. And it goes on and on and on. And as the months dragged on, as winter set in, bear in mind this happened very early summer, May. Now it's winter, it's December, and the first snows are falling over Gilgo Beach. And as the year and the decade as well are drawing to a close, Marlier decided to do something different. He decided to do some research. He decided to think more critically about his search. He wasn't just going out there thinking, following paths of least resistance. He was, before he went out, trying to be a bit more scientific about it. And so John Marlier, based his choice of search in December on FBI data indicating that dumped bodies are usually found close to roadways. And so that informed his strategy. And so despite thick vegetation, despite even a layer of snow, Malia's cadaver dog, it's a German Shepherd, alerted to a scent which the pair tracked to a skeleton wrapped in disintegrating burlap. And they thought, wow, we found her. But it wasn't her. The remains were identified as Melissa Barthélemy. And then police discovered 3 additional bodies while searching the scene for further evidence. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. All of them were found within about 500 feet, that's about 150 meters from each other. That happened on December 11th, 2010. They were looking for Shannon Gilbert and they ended up stumbling on one set of human remains, then another, then another, then another. It was an unbelievable stroke of luck for law enforcement. Something similar happened in the Morphew case. Investigators stumbled on human remains without specifically looking for the remains in question. It was also unfathomably bad luck for our serial killer here, who was just hitting his stride. And because suddenly, just like that, his game was up. That's why he stopped. Not because Victoria made him a human being again, and not because he developed empathy, because he'd been found out in a big way. It was also not because architecture was making him feel better about himself. He stopped because he felt he had no choice. And that brings us to the moment of truth and also the even shorter answer. Again, how did Rex Human rehabilitate himself? Well, I told you it was a trick question and that it's a trap because there was no rehabilitation. And the key insight here is this: serial killers cannot be rehabilitated and certainly do not rehabilitate themselves. In fact, putting serial killers in prison does nothing to change who they are. For serial killers, prison is not a deterrent to crime. So what are we dealing with here? We're left with another question. If the last crime happened in 2010, didn't the killer, for all intents and purposes, somehow rein himself in anyway? And if he didn't kill again for 10 or 12 or 13 more years, and maybe that's a big if, but if he didn't, well, wasn't he rehabilitated after all? And you might say, no, but serial killers can't be rehabilitated. Okay, they're not rehabilitated, but then something else. On pause, on hiatus, rehabilitated in some form or fashion. Ergo, isn't the human we see in that 2022 interview basically reformed?
Because of you, I've changed. I'm unplugged. A new man, so to speak, like you, apparently free.
But he's not free, right? He's not actually free. Because what's happening is he's watching his pursuers closing in on him, watching them like a hawk. And guess what's happening? The hunter is becoming the hunted. That bloodlust and sexual sadism might build up, and perhaps he could exercise some of it through hunting or sleeping with prostitutes. And perhaps he tried to put a lid on his online adventures with pornography. But definitely he was distracted by the hunt that was taking place for him. And now he's trying to elude his pursuers. He's also trying to maintain a kind of surveillance, maintain a sense of what they're doing, what they know, what they're finding out. That's kind of what he's preoccupied with. That's his new obsession. Overall, though, no, in terms of the serial killing, that is an itch that can never be scratched. It's never going to go away. The Long Island serial killer's longest stretch without a human kill, as far as we know, was 10 years. And now he's about to embark on that same kind of stretch, and he's going to stretch it out even further. In July 2023, when Huerman was arrested in Midtown Manhattan, and that was the same month, well, it was a month before I was staying in a hotel a couple of 100 feet from where he was arrested, a couple of 100 feet from where his office building was. I was wandering around the same area. Well, at that stage, July 2023, that clock, the serial killer clock, stood at 13 years since the last victim we know about. And so I would say his arrest happened just in the nick of time. What do you guys think? Now, again, I'm not going to take it further than that. If you do want me to take it further, then we can do a sequel to this series. But you can let me know how much you'd like that in the comments, hitting the thanks button, and just kind of expressing your support one way or the other. Thank you for listening. If we don't continue the series, I think you'll agree with me it was worthwhile. We did make some discoveries, not only about this suspect, but also about the case itself, the woods of the case, the trees of the self, and I think also to some extent our place in the world and how we need to guard our thoughts and also be more inclined to think critically and be aware of processes that we are in that are going in a particular direction, and being self-aware to stop those processes, to change those processes, to redirect those processes, to take charge of those processes, or indeed to walk away from them. Anyway, I hope this is useful to you. Thank you for listening. Thanks a lot for being here, guys, and I'll see you guys next time.